All right, diving in today, getting into some, deep philosophical waters. We're going to be looking at reliabilist epistemology.
Okay.
And, at its core, it's this idea of how do we figure out if a belief, is justified or counts as knowledge? Like, how do we get to that point?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And this is, a really important discussion in philosophy, especially for someone who wants to understand what's going on in epistemology today. You have to have a pretty solid grasp of reliabilism.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what's really interesting about reliabilism is that it's this idea that, whether or not you're justified in believing something depends on the process that led you to that belief.
Right.
So it's not just about like what you're thinking right now,
Yes.
but it's about the history of how you came to have that belief.
Right. Like, where did it come from?
Exactly. Yeah. And, philosophers are really interested in this because it suggests a kind of naturalistic approach to epistemology, which is this idea that we can explain epistemic concepts like justification and knowledge in terms of more basic, natural processes. So we don't have to appeal to, mysterious or spooky, thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. We don't have to bring in any extra baggage.
Exactly, yeah. So reliabilism is trying to kind of ground epistemology in something that we can understand in terms of the way our minds work and the way the world works.
Right. So today we're going to do this deep dive into reliabilism, and we're going to figure out where it came from, what the main ideas are, what problems it faces, and then how the theory has evolved.
Okay.
So just a nice quick overview, something for all the philosophers out there to kind of bring them up to speed. And, the main source that we're going to be drawing from is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So I guess we can kind of start off, historically.
Yeah.
How did this theory even come about?
Right, yeah. So, back in the 1960s, epistemologists were really focused on, trying to define knowledge.
Right.
And a really popular view at the time was this idea that knowledge is justified through belief.
Right. So you have to believe something that's true, and you have to have a good reason for believing it.
Exactly.
So it's not just a lucky guess.
Right. You can't just, stumble upon the truth. You have to have some sort of justification for why you think it's true.
Right.
But then along comes Edmund Gettier.
Oh, yes, Gettier.
And he basically throws a wrench in this whole idea with his famous, Gettier cases.
Right.
So these are thought experiments where someone has a belief that is true and justified, but it doesn't seem like they really know it.
Right. It's like they just got lucky.
Exactly, yeah. So, he kind of blew up the traditional definition of knowledge, and this led to a lot of new thinking about what knowledge really is and what justification really is.
Right. So the Gettier cases, they were a huge deal, right?
Yeah, they really shook things up for epistemologists. And actually, some of the early attempts to, deal with these Gettier cases had some, elements of reliabilism in them, even though the term wasn't really used back then.
Really?
Yeah. So, for example, there were things like relevant alternatives theories.
Okay.
And truth-tracking theories.
Okay.
So relevant alternatives theories basically said that, you know something if you can rule out all the other possibilities where it could be false.
Okay.
And truth-tracking theories said that your beliefs have to kind of, track the truth across different possible worlds.
Interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of these theories include concepts like sensitivity.
Okay.
Which was this idea that, if the proposition that you believe were false and you wouldn't believe it.
Okay.
And safety, which was the idea that, if you were to believe something, then it would be true.
Interesting.
So all of these concepts kind of point toward this idea of reliability.
Right. So even before reliabilism was a big thing, people were starting to think about the connection between knowledge and reliability.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, epistemologists started focusing more on, just justification itself.
Right. Not just as a part of knowledge, but as its own thing.
Exactly, yeah. Because it seemed like justification was necessary for knowledge, but not sufficient, as Gettier had shown.
Right.
So, they were trying to figure out what justification is all on its own.
Okay, and this is where Alvin Goldman comes in, right?
Yes, exactly.
His 1979 paper, What is Justified Belief? It was hugely influential, right?
Yeah, this paper was a major turning point,
Yeah.
Some people even call it a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Or the reliabilist revolution.
I like that, reliabilist revolution.
Right, because it really did kind of change the way people were thinking about justification.
Okay, so what was at the heart of this reliabilist revolution? What was Goldman's main idea?
Well, his main idea was that justification doesn't just depend on what's happening in your mind right now,
Okay.
but it also depends on the history of how you came to have that belief, and specifically the reliability of the process that caused you to have that belief.
Right, so not just what you're thinking about right now, but how you got there.
Exactly, yeah. So, for example, if you believe that it's going to rain tomorrow because you saw a weather forecast, then the justification of your belief depends on how reliable weather forecasts usually are.
Right, yeah. It makes sense.
So if weather forecasts are usually right, then you're probably justified in believing that it's going to rain. But if weather forecasts are usually wrong, then you're probably not justified.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, Goldman wasn't the first person to talk about this kind of idea.
Right, what we talked about before.
Right, yeah. There were earlier thinkers who had kind of hinted at similar notions.
Okay,
Like Ramsey talked about knowledge being obtained by a reliable process,
okay.
and Unger talked about knowledge being non-accidental true belief. And Armstrong used the term reliable to describe beliefs that were kind of like thermometers.
Right,
So they're reliably indicating the temperature.
okay.
So there was this kind of history of thinking about reliability and knowledge.
Right, but Goldman really brought it to the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. And what made his theory so influential was that he laid out a very clear set of criteria for what an adequate theory of justification should look like.
Okay.
So he said that a good theory of justification should not invoke the concept of justification itself.
Okay,
So it can't be circular.
right.
And it shouldn't appeal to other epistemic notions like reasonableness or rationality.
All right, so you can't just say, well, it's justified because it's reasonable.
Right, exactly, because then you'd have to explain what reasonableness is.
Right.
So he was really trying to give a very basic account of justification that didn't depend on any other epistemic concepts.
Okay, so he wanted to kind of ground it in something more fundamental.
Exactly, yeah. So he
Mhm.
said that the only concepts that are allowed in a theory of justification are things like beliefs and desires,
Okay.
and sensory experiences and memories,
Okay.
and truth and falsity, which are non-epistemic,
Okay.
and the causal relation.
Okay.
So, how one event causes another event.
Okay, so basically anything that's not already an epistemic concept.
Exactly, yeah. And he was also really focused on doxastic justification.
Doxastic justification.
Yeah, which is just whether or not a belief is justified,
Okay.
as opposed to propositional justification, which is whether or not there are grounds for believing a proposition.
Okay, so doxastic justification is about whether or not the person is justified in believing it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, he was really trying to get at what it means for a person to be justified in believing something.
Okay.
And, he used this example of, this guy named Arthur.
Arthur.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who believes Q and R, and then comes to believe P, which is a logical consequence of Q and R. And Goldman's point was that just because Arthur's belief in Q and R is justified doesn't mean that his belief in P is justified.
Okay, why not?
Because maybe he just started wishing that P were true,
Okay.
and then somehow convinced himself that it was true.
Right.
Or maybe he used some really bad reasoning to get from Q and R to P.
Right, so even if he's right, he didn't get there in the right way.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So Goldman's point was that a belief has to be produced or generated in the right way in order for it to be justified.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this is where the concept of reliability comes in.
Right, so how did he define reliability?
Well, he defined it in terms of truth ratio.
Okay.
So how often a process produces true beliefs.
Okay.
And he said that there are two ways to understand this truth ratio.
Yeah.
One is in terms of actual frequency.
Okay.
So how often the process actually produces true beliefs in the real world.
Okay.
And the other is in terms of propensity, which is how likely the process is to produce true beliefs in general, even in possible worlds that are different from the actual world.
Okay, so it's not just about what happens in this world, but what would happen in other possible worlds.
Exactly, yeah. And he acknowledged that the exact truth ratio that's required for justification is kind of vague,
Right.
because the concept of justification itself is kind of vague.
Right, it's not like there's a precise number.
Right, yeah. But he said that it has to be significantly greater than chance.
Okay, so it can't just be a coin flip.
Right, yeah. It has to be a process that's more likely to produce true beliefs than false beliefs.
Okay.
And he also emphasized that process reliabilism is a historical theory.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, it means that the justification of a belief can depend on the justification of other beliefs that were formed earlier. So, for example, if you believe that it's going to rain tomorrow because you saw a weather forecast, then the justification of your belief also depends on the justification of the beliefs that led you to believe that weather forecasts are reliable.
Yep.
So maybe you believe that weather forecasts are reliable because you've seen them be right in the past.
Right.
Or maybe you believe it because you trust the meteorologists who make the forecasts.
Right.
But whatever the reason, the justification of your belief about the rain tomorrow ultimately depends on the justification of these earlier beliefs.
Okay, so it's kind of a chain of justification.
Exactly, yeah. And this is different from other theories of justification that are more focused on the current time slice.
Okay, so theories that are just focused on what you're thinking about right now.
Exactly, yeah. So, process reliabilism is this idea that justification has a history
Right.
and that the justification of a belief can depend on the justification of other beliefs that were formed earlier.
Okay, so he formalized all these ideas with some principles, right?
Right, yeah. So he has one principle for beliefs that aren't based on other beliefs,
Okay.
which is basically that if a belief is produced by a reliable process, then it's justified.
Okay.
And then he has another principle for beliefs that are based on other beliefs, which is more complicated.
Okay.
But the basic idea is that if a belief is produced by a conditionally reliable process and the beliefs that it's based on are justified, then the new belief is also justified.
Okay, so you have to have those two conditions met.
Exactly, yeah.
So, the process itself has to be reliable.
Right.
And the beliefs that you're starting with have to
Yeah.
be justified.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. And you said that these principles really align with our intuitions, right?
Right, yeah, I think so. So, we typically think that if we see something clearly, we're justified in believing that we saw it.
Right.
Or if we deduce something from premises that we know to be true, we're justified in believing the conclusion.
Right.
And those are both cases where the beliefs are produced by reliable processes.
Mhm.
And we also think that beliefs that are produced by unreliable processes, like wishful thinking or hasty generalization, are not justified.
Right. Yeah. It just makes sense.
Right. And it's not just that we think these beliefs are justified or not justified.
Right.
We also have intuitions about how justified they are.
Okay.
So, for example, we might think that a belief that's based on eyewitness testimony is more justified than a belief that's based on hearsay.
Right.
And that's because eyewitness testimony is generally more reliable than hearsay.
Okay, so our intuitions about how justified a belief is kind of track the reliability of the process that produced it.
Exactly, yeah. So, this is all kind of suggestive that reliabilism is on the right track.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the challenges.
Okay.
Because as with any good philosophical theory, there are some challenges.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to reliabilism.
Right.
But there are a few that are, kind of the most famous ones.
Okay, so let's start with the clairvoyance problem.
Okay. So this was an objection raised by Lawrence Bonjour.
Okay.
And the basic idea is that you can imagine someone who has this perfectly reliable clairvoyant ability.
Okay.
So they can just, see things that are happening far away or in the future or whatever.
Okay.
But they have no evidence that they have this ability.
Okay.
So they just suddenly have these beliefs pop into their head, and they're
No.
always true, but they have no reason to think that they're true.
Right, so they're just kind of coming out of nowhere.
Exactly, yeah. And Bonjour's point was that these beliefs don't seem justified,
Okay.
even though they're produced by a reliable process.
Right, because the person has no reason to trust the process.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a problem for reliabilism because it seems to imply that a belief can be justified even if the person who has the belief has no reason to think that it's true.
Right, so it kind of goes against our intuitions about justification.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so how do reliabilists respond to this problem?
Well, there are a few different ways. One way is to say that, justification is relative to the person's evidence.
Okay.
So even though the clairvoyance beliefs are produced by a reliable process, they're not justified because the clairvoyant has no evidence that the process is reliable.
Okay.
Another way is to say that, the clairvoyance beliefs are justified, but they're not knowledge.
Okay.
Because knowledge requires more than just justification.
Right, it requires truth.
Right. And it requires that the belief be connected to the truth in the right way.
Okay.
And in this case, the clairvoyance beliefs are not connected to the truth in the right way because they're not based on evidence.
Okay.
So, there are a few different ways to respond to this problem.
Right.
But it's definitely a challenge for reliabilism.
Okay. And then there's the new evil demon problem, which I think is related.
Right, yeah. So
But-
this is a more extreme version of the clairvoyance problem.
Okay.
So imagine that you're living in a world that's controlled by an evil demon.
An evil demon.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this demon is constantly feeding you false sensory experiences.
Okay.
So you think you're seeing a tree, but it's actually just an illusion created by the demon.
Right.
And you think you're hearing a bird singing, but it's actually just the demon playing a trick on you.
Right.
So all of your beliefs about the world are false,
Okay.
but you have no way of knowing that they're false.
Right. Because it all seems real to you.
Exactly, yeah. And the problem for reliabilism is that it seems to imply that your beliefs in this situation are not justified.
Yeah.
Because they're produced by processes that are unreliable.
Right.
Because your senses are constantly deceiving you.
Right. Yeah.
But it seems like your beliefs should be justified.
Okay.
Because you have no reason to think that you're being deceived.
Right. You're just going about your life
Right.
and everything seems normal.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a problem for reliabilism because it seems to imply that a belief can be unjustified even if the person who has the belief has no reason to think that it's false.
Right. So it's kind of the flip side of the clairvoyance problem.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So how do reliabilists respond to this problem?
Well, there are a few different ways. One way is to say that, the person in the demon world actually does have some evidence that they're being deceived.
Right.
So, for example, they might notice that some of their beliefs are inconsistent with each other.
Yeah.
Or they might notice that their beliefs are not leading to successful actions.
Right.
So, they might try to walk through a door, but they run into a wall instead.
Right.
And if they're paying attention, they might start to suspect that something is wrong.
Okay.
Another way to respond is to say that, justification is relative to the person's environment.
Okay.
So in the demon world, the person's beliefs are not justified because their environment is not conducive to reliable belief formation.
Okay.
But in the real world, our beliefs are justified because our environment is generally conducive to reliable belief formation. So, there are a few different ways to respond to this problem.
Right.
But it's definitely a challenge for reliabilism.
Okay, so the last big challenge you mentioned is the generality problem.
Right, yeah. So this problem has to do with how we describe the processes that produce beliefs.
Okay.
So, if I see a tree, I can describe the process that produced my belief as seeing.
Right.
Or I can describe it as visual perception.
Okay.
Or I can describe it as the process of light reflecting off the tree and entering my eyes, and then my brain processing that information and forming a belief.
Right.
And all of these descriptions are accurate,
Okay.
but there are different levels of generality.
Right.
And the problem is that the reliability of a process can depend on how it's described.
Okay, I see. So if you describe it in a really general way, it might seem reliable.
Right, yeah. So for example, the process of seeing is generally reliable.
Right.
But if you describe it in a more specific way, it might not be as reliable. So, for example, the process of seeing a tree in the fog is not as reliable as the process of seeing a tree on a clear day.
Right, because the fog could obscure your vision.
Exactly, yeah. So the problem for reliabilism is that it doesn't tell us which level of generality we should use when we're describing processes.
Right, so how do we decide which description to use?
Well, that's the problem.
Okay.
And if we don't know which description to use, then we don't know how to assess the reliability of the process.
Right, and then we don't know whether or not the belief is justified.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a really tricky problem for reliabilism.
Okay, so how do reliabilists respond to this problem?
Well, there are a few different ways. One way is to say that we should just use the most natural description of the process.
Okay.
So if I see a tree, the most natural description of the process is probably just seeing.
Okay.
And if I see a tree in the fog, the most natural description is probably seeing a tree in the fog.
Okay, so we just go with what seems most obvious.
Exactly, yeah. Another way to respond is to say that we should use the description that's most relevant to the epistemic situation.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, it means that we should use the description that captures the features of the process that are most likely to affect its reliability.
Okay, so if I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm justified in believing that I saw a tree, then I should use a description that takes into account the lighting conditions, the distance to the tree, and anything else that could affect my ability to see it accurately.
Exactly, yeah. And another way to respond is to say that we should just bite the bullet and say that there's no single correct way to describe a process.
Okay.
And that the reliability of a process can vary depending on how it's described.
Okay, so it's just kind of indeterminate.
Exactly, yeah. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, so we just have to accept that there's some vagueness.
Exactly.
All right, so those are the big three challenges to reliabilism. You also mentioned some further challenges.
Yeah, so there are a few other challenges that are worth mentioning. One is the bootstrapping problem,
Okay.
which has to do with the fact that we often use our beliefs to justify other beliefs.
Right.
So, for example, if I believe that my memory is reliable, I might use that belief to justify my belief that I went to the grocery store yesterday.
Right.
But how did I come to believe that my memory is reliable in the first place?
Right.
Well, maybe I used my memory to justify that belief too.
Okay.
So it seems like I'm just going in circles.
Right. You're pulling yourself up by your own bootstrap.
Exactly, yeah. And the problem for reliabilism is that it doesn't seem to have a good way to deal with this problem.
Okay.
Because it says that a belief is justified if it's produced by a reliable process.
Right.
But if I'm using my beliefs to justify my beliefs about the reliability of the processes that produce my beliefs, then it seems like I'm not really getting anywhere.
Right. It's all circular.
Exactly.
Okay. And what's another challenge?
Another challenge is the problem of defeat, which has to do with the fact that new evidence can sometimes undermine the justification of a belief.
Okay.
So, for example, if I see a red ball in good lighting conditions, I might be justified in believing that the ball is red.
Right.
But if I then learn that the ball is actually white, but it's being illuminated by a red light, then my belief is defeated.
Right. The new evidence undermines your original justification.
Exactly, yeah. And the problem for reliabilism is that it doesn't seem to have a good way to account for defeat.
Okay.
Because it says that a belief is justified if it's produced by a reliable process.
Right.
But in this case, my belief was produced by a reliable process.
Right.
But it's no longer justified because of the new evidence.
Okay.
So reliabilism seems to have a problem with how to deal with new evidence.
Okay.
And then there's the problem of temporality,
Okay.
which has to do with the fact that the reliability of a process can change over time.
Right.
So, for example, the process of forming beliefs based on weather forecasts is more reliable now than it was in the past.
Right, because we have better technology now.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep.
And the problem for reliabilism is that it doesn't tell us how to take into account these changes in reliability over time.
Huh?
So, if I form a belief today based on a weather forecast, should I assess the justification of my belief based on the reliability of weather forecasts today?
Okay.
Or should I assess it based on the reliability of weather forecasts in the past?
Right, or some combination of the two.
Right. So, this is another problem that reliabilism needs to deal with.
Okay, so despite all of these challenges, you said that reliabilism is still a really active area of research, right?
Right. Yeah, it's still a very popular theory, and there are a lot of people working on it.
Okay, so what are some of the new developments in reliabilism?
Well, one development is normality reliabilism.
Normality reliabilism.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the idea that a process is reliable if it produces true beliefs under normal conditions.
Okay.
So, for example, visual perception is generally reliable under normal conditions.
Right.
But it's not reliable if you're hallucinating or if you're looking through a distorted lens or something like that.
Right.
So normality reliabilism says that we should focus on the reliability of processes under normal conditions and ignore the cases where the conditions are abnormal.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this helps to deal with some of the problems that we talked about earlier, like the new evil demon problem.
Right, because in the new evil demon world, the conditions are abnormal.
Exactly, yeah. So normality reliabilism says that the person's beliefs in the demon world are not justified because the conditions are abnormal.
Okay.
But our beliefs in the real world are justified because the conditions are generally normal.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another development is the idea of social reliabilism.
Social reliabilism.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the idea that the justification of a belief can depend on the reliability of social processes.
Okay.
So, for example, if I believe something because I read it in a textbook, then the justification of my belief depends on the reliability of the process of textbook writing and publishing. Right. Or if I believe something because an expert told me, then the justification of my belief depends on the reliability of the expert's testimony.
Okay.
So social reliabilism says that we need to take into account these social factors when we're assessing the justification of beliefs.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the idea of reliabilism about degrees of belief.
Okay.
So this is the idea that we can apply the concept of reliability to our credences, which are our degrees of confidence in our beliefs.
Okay.
So for example, if I'm 90% confident that it's going to rain tomorrow, then my credence in the proposition "it will rain tomorrow" is 0.9.
Okay.
And reliabilism about degrees of belief says that a credence is justified if it's produced by a reliable process.
Okay.
So, for example, if I form my credence in the proposition, it will rain tomorrow by looking at a weather forecast, then the justification of my credence depends on the reliability of weather forecasts.
Okay.
So, reliabilism about degrees of belief is basically just an extension of traditional reliabilism to the case of credences.
Okay, so it's like applying the same principles to a different kind of belief.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and you said there are also some cousins and spin-offs of reliabilism.
Right, yeah. So, one important cousin is virtue reliabilism.
Virtue reliabilism.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, this is the idea that justification depends on the possession of intellectual virtues.
Okay.
So, intellectual virtues are things like open-mindedness, intellectual honesty, and carefulness.
Okay.
And virtue reliabilists say that a belief is justified if it's produced by the exercise of an intellectual virtue.
Okay, so it's not just about the process itself, but about the person's character.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow.
So, for example, if I form a belief by carefully considering all of the evidence, then my belief is justified because I've exercised the intellectual virtue of carefulness.
Expert speaker.